Hello and welcome back to the Racing Games channel. My name is Mark and today I'm here to ask you a question. Which is better? Games with actual racing, with boots, or tyres in this case, on the ground, or instead games where you manage the team from the pit wall? Both have their respective games, with each providing their own unique experiences for players. So is one better than the other? Here's what I think. First, let's talk about the actual racing. I'm talking about games like Gran Turismo, Forza and Burnout, where the focus is mostly on the racing itself. Sure, you can acquire and customize vehicles, maybe even create your own events or races, but ultimately, these are racing games focused on you, your car, and the track ahead. The biggest appeal of these games is the on-track action. Gran Turismo is built around the realism of racing, real vehicles racing on real tracks, or tracks inspired by reality, with realistic physics. Forza is more arcade-like, with real vehicles still, but in a less realistic environment. Despite our demands, they still won't close Edinburgh for a racing event. Burnout is the complete opposite end of the spectrum from Gran Turismo, with the entire aim of the game being to cause as much chaos as possible whilst racing. These are just a handful of examples. These days pretty much every racing series has its own game. For those that don't, stay tuned to the channel for a future video about that. If you're a fan of street racing, there's Need for Speed or Burnout. Track racing has Gran Turismo. Rally racing has Dirt or WRC. Oh, and there's also Wipeout for all you spaceship/stealth bomber looking vehicle racing fans. As I said, the main selling point of these games is the chance to get involved in the action. We've all dreamt of being a racing driver at some point in our lives, and these games are the perfect opportunity for those of us who never made it a reality. Sim racing is the true escapism, where you strap yourself into a racing seat bolted to the floor of your spare bedroom for a few hours, and finally nail that lap of the Nordschleife. We've not even talked about racing esports yet, a subject so big that probably deserves its own video too. The racing esports scene is growing more and more every year, with the F1 esports series even segueing last year into the virtual Grand Prix series televised on Sky Sports. In terms of the argument, it looks as though actual racing is winning this hands down so far, but let's take a look at the other side for a moment and see. So we've talked about being behind the wheel, but what about being behind the whole team? Believe it or not, there are games for this too. Back in 1995, Microprose released Grand Prix Manager, a fairly self-explanatory game. The goal was to manage an F1 team to championship success, and featured the 1995 Formula 1 season. Now before all you ZX Spectrum players start hammering me in the comments, this is the second Grand Prix Manager game to be released. The first, also called Grand Prix Manager, was released in 1984, and was published by Silicon Joy. Even back in the 80s, these games set the standard that is still followed today. Players take charge of a racing team, signing drivers, mechanics and sponsors, as well as managing the strategy during the race. In the 1984 Grand Prix Manager, the strategy was as involved as choosing the depth of the tyre tread. Just imagine that in F1 2021. These days, the genre is mostly represented by Motorsport Manager. Originally released for mobile back in 2014, the game has since evolved, with a PC version released in 2016 and a Nintendo Switch port arriving in 2019. In Motorsport Manager, players can take charge of a team in one of three racing classes, these being Formula, Endurance and GT Racing. Each class is split into three tiers in the PC version, with the third iteration of the mobile game having a fourth tier added. To rise through the tiers, players need to win the championship with their team to earn promotion. Finishing bottom of all tiers except the lowest will result in the team being relegated back to the previous tier. Fans of the Football Manager series will be all too familiar with this concept. This is a very simple explanation of the game. Below the surface there is a lot more going on. Each team principal will have random events to deal with, such as the chief designer leaking plans for your car, as well as having to manage the design of both the car and team factory. It is your decision whether to spend the annual budget on finally getting the promised performance out of your engine, or throwing it all into a helipad for the factory to attract new sponsors. Speaking of sponsors, these are also randomised, but are dictated by the team's performances. If you're winning races and rising through the ranks, you'll attract newer and richer sponsors. If you're languishing at the bottom of the league, you might still get an offer from Discount Dave's DVDs, but that's about it. In terms of race day management, this is also pretty deep. Before the race weekend even begins, the decision making has started. Principals must choose which drivers they are taking to the race. Could the reserve driver finally get their dream call-up? As well as this, the principals also must decide which tyre compounds to take for the race, assuming you upgraded the weather forecasting station at the factory for an accurate prediction, and even which upgrades will be applied to which car. During the race, it is up to you to decide when your drivers pit, what tyres they drive on, any repairs that will be made during these pit stops, and even what driving style each driver will have. If that's not enough to deal with, there's more. Team principals will also have to attend a league meeting at least once a season to discuss the rules of that league. Each meeting consists of a vote, with the player able to bring their own vote to the table too, for a price of course. This means teams can use the vote to change the rules to their liking, kind of like a virtual Red Bull. Once the votes have been cast, the rules are changed for the next racing season. So overall then, there's quite a lot to manage. So there's both sides of the argument. Before we make a decision though, there is a third option. You might have noticed I've left some games out of this video so far, mostly the F1 games from Codemasters. That's because these games fit neither of these categories, especially F1 2020 and 2021 with the My Team game mode. For those of you unfamiliar, My Team sees the player forming their own F1 team and joining the grid as the 11th team. Players must choose an engine supplier for their car, sign a reserve driver, and agree sponsorship deals, just like in a management game. Yet they must also drive the car each weekend as the team's primary driver, just like in a racer. Oh, and that's not including the features also found in career mode, where players are responsible for developing both the car and the facilities to help the team perform out on track. So yeah, these games kind of fit into a bit of a grey area. On the one hand, you have the race weekend to deal with, where you're in the thick of the action. On the other, you're planning out your pit strategy, as well as thinking about whether to upgrade your aerodynamics department or build a simulator for your second driver. All of this whilst tackling Eau Rouge. Now you don't control your teammate's strategy, but you can still mess up their race if you both pit at the same time. So that's yet another factor to think about. So now we don't have two arguments to choose from, we have three. So which is better? A full-on racer, a team manager, or a mix of both? Well, the answer might surprise you. None of them. In truth, there never will be a right answer to this question. Personally, I prefer more of the management side of things. I'm the first to admit I'm not the best out on track, especially with the new downforce regulations in F1 2021. Anyone who's watched me take on the F1 challenges, firstly, I am so very sorry, and secondly, you can see that racing isn't necessarily my thing. I am much better with race strategy, pulling off epic pit stop undercuts and helping my drivers master their tyre management. You might be much better out on track and therefore disagree with me. This is a very subjective subject, and that's what makes these games so great. It really is the player's choice. If you want to get stuck into the racing, grab a copy of Gran Turismo. If you want to lead your team to glory, Motorsport Manager is for you. If you want a mix of both, then F1 2021 is perfect. Oh, and if you want a game that promised so much yet delivered so little, I believe Banjo-Kazooie Nuts and Bolts is still available. This might seem like a cop-out, but that's what our comment section is for. Let us know which you prefer down below. For now though, thank you for watching. I've been Mark from Racing Games. Please like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video. And now I'm off to measure my tyre tread for the next race weekend.